I'm excited to present a little bit this afternoon. I've been working on a lot of these issues related to Hebrew creation, cosmology, the origins kind of issues for quite some time. And I was honored to be able to take some of what I've been writing over the years, turning that into a book that RTB will be using and coming out sometime next year around the same time Hugh's book is coming out. And so I just want to share part of what I've been doing through that. This is largely chapter 1 from the book, but I want to address this question of what makes Genesis different. So let me start by reading from Genesis itself. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So what should we make of Genesis and the history in this Hebrew story of creation? Is it a myth? Is it history? Is it a story just like every other story of cosmic origins from the ancient world? Or if Hebrew cosmology is not the same, what makes Genesis different? So now in the study of literature from the ancient Near East, a significant number of scholars over the past 60 years or so, both secular and religious, have argued that the creation story of Genesis is mythology, akin to and shaped by the shared cultural perspective of the ancient world. The most recent scholar to go down this path is William Lane Craig in his book, A Quest for the Historical Adam. Now, those who share Craig's claim that Genesis is what he calls mytho-history see Genesis as a point of convergence between the Hebrew worldview and the typical person living in the ancient Near East. But is this really the best way to view Hebrew creation? So before I answer that question, let me define just a couple key terms. So in this book that I'll be putting out and in this talk right here, I'm going to use the word cosmology and cosmogony as synonyms. Technically, there can be some distinctions. It depends who you read, but it's really not that important. Both I'm just going to use synonymously to describe any system of thought that attempts to explain the origins of the universe in scientific, philosophical, and or theological terms. Now, the term worldview, which is what I get to teach and be a part of, and I get to play a big part in that in the life of a lot of young people, which I'm excited about. So I'm going to use that term worldview to describe the lens we use to interpret the world and focus our observations into a clear narrative that answers the questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Now, worldview answers really 6 key questions. How did I come into being? How can I know the meaning for my life? What is the right thing to do? How can I fulfill my moral purpose? And what happens when I die? Oh, and how will my legacy be judged? Now, given a particular worldview, we apply it to various fields of inquiry, like human origins, like cosmic origins, through what is called a paradigm. So now a paradigm is really this. It functions inside the worldview to provide a field-specific framework, a specific way within any given field. So a paradigm might be a way we look at archaeology today or a different scientific endeavor. So a paradigm takes our worldview and lets us look at a very specific field of inquiry to determine what counts as knowledge. So when I look at archaeology, what am I going to count as a fact of history? When I look at biology, what do I count as evidence? Okay, so worldview shapes that. Paradigms help us look at specifics and then evaluate that. So these concepts of worldview and paradigm are important for understanding what makes Genesis different from other ancient Near East mythologies. So scholars who accept what I call a convergent worldview paradigm treat the people and events of Genesis 1 through 11 as literary symbols with little or no relationship to history, to the material realities of the cosmos. Like every other people group in the ancient Near East, the Hebrew priests and scribes, they say, used the mythologies of Genesis to teach important religious truths and justify Israel's temple practices. In this sense, scholars who advocate for this convergent worldview paradigm see a clear unity between Genesis and all other ancient cosmologies. Now, to those like myself who read Genesis 1 through 11 as, or unlike myself, who read Genesis 1 through 11 as myth, my own study leads me to the conclusion that the story of Genesis is historical narrative, certainly though with a theological purpose, or what I'll call theo-history. No longer mytho-history, theo-history. See what I did there? That's tricky. I'm educated, I can make up words. So this Hebrew theo-history then of creation was undergirded by a worldview that did not converge. It was distinct. So it did not converge with her neighbors, but significantly diverged from the surrounding nations. Now, scholars like John Oswalt in his book, The Bible Among Other Myths, shares in this view, which I label the divergent worldview paradigm. Scholars in this camp argue that while the literary style of Genesis has elements common to other ancient mythologies, the content itself is quite distinct. The essential elements of the Hebrew origin stories are distinct from other ancient mythologies and similar only in their secondary, or what philosophers call really accidental elements. Specifically, there's a broad agreement that the genre of Genesis has clear points of stylistic unity with other ancient mythologies. However, unlike other ancient cosmologies, the Hebrew worldview perceived the people, the places, the events of Genesis as historical and not merely religious symbols. So given these very two different approaches, the next question simply is this: how should we understand Genesis? So Hebrew cosmology, written by Moses in an ancient language for an ancient people, reflects the unique Hebrew worldview, which was shaped through the direct revelation of Yahweh himself. The inspired nature of Moses' historical narrative gives the modern reader confidence that we can understand the meaning of the text. The uniqueness of Genesis as theo-history means that Hebrew cosmology offers a dependable foundation for knowing something true about our material origins, for shaping our ethical practices and priorities, directing our moral decision-making, and guiding scientific inquiry. Now, to understand how Genesis is unique from ancient Near East mythologies, let's look at three elements that are essential to the Hebrew worldview. Whoops. I'm really behind on my slides here. Wow. I had animations I didn't know were on there. Somebody should have yelled, "You're wrong, you're wrong." All right, this is where we should be. So, this idea, there's three elements essential to Hebrew worldview. One, Genesis is monotheism, not panentheism. And I know John Bloom has a problem with that word, but I think I accommodated for your critique on that. The second thing is that Genesis is special revelation, not cultic theology. And third, Genesis is theo-history, not mytho-history. So let me unpack each of these three things. So the first idea that Genesis is monotheism and not panentheism. So how much of Hebrew cosmology was shaped by ancient Near Eastern religions, and how much was shaped by Yahweh's self-revelation? Most scholars agree, in principle at least, that the Hebrew writings were influenced by the religion, culture, and politics of the ancient world. Numerous references to the foreign kings and gods and cultic practices make clear the necessity of understanding biblical cosmology within both its literary and historical context. However, the fundamental difference between scholars is what they accept as essential versus what they accept as secondary, or like I said earlier, accidental to the Hebrew worldview. One clear line of distinction between Genesis and other ancient myths is the revelation that Yahweh alone sits as the sole creator and only God. This resolute monotheism was an essential quality of Hebrew cosmology. So for the people of the ancient Near East, their creation stories were shaped by polytheism, a belief that the world was inhabited by many finite gods, driven by their many human-like desires, such as sexual pleasure, who ruled over their own spatial domains. Another useful word, well suited to the discussion of ancient mythologies, is panentheism, or finite godism. Now, panentheism, as defined by Geisler, it's a much more recent word, but it's useful, I think. As defined by Geisler, describes well the finite godism of various ancient Near East religions, whose gods were limited in power and existed simultaneously, both in the human world and outside the human world. Geisler describes it as they existed in two poles. So essentially saying they were bipolar gods. But that has some obvious psychological connotations that I didn't want to impugn the character of these gods, so I didn't call them bipolar. But anyway, that's Geisler. So panentheism is a useful word, though, in the sense that it reminds the modern reader that, unlike Israel, the people of the ancient Near East believed in a collection of gods who existed above the material world, yet interconnected with it, with the very fabric of nature itself. And while with the exception of Israel, the people of the ancient world did not perceive history as an arrow of progress from a past moment in time towards some fixed end. Human history for these people was a drama played out in the cycle of life and death amongst this pantheon of gods. The gods of the ancient Near East were limited in power, lived in constant state of battle, and the death of any god was meaningless to the existence of the cosmos. The people of the ancient world saw their service to these finite gods and goddesses, just like humans, whose earthly existence reflected the same cycle of life and death. Humans were forever bound to their gods, were warriors like this eternal drama being played out. And as a consequence, as they extinguished lives in battle, or the people they took as slaves had no moral significance. Monotheism led Israel to see the cosmic history and human life in a very different way. Monotheism was foundational for Israel's understanding of history as linear, with a fixed beginning in time and space. Yahweh was not a cosmic warrior trapped in a natural cycle of life and death. Yahweh stood alone as the eternal, immaterial God, and nature was his finite material creation. The story of Genesis, therefore, was accepted by the Hebrews as a revelation of a cosmic past, a human present, and a promised future. So for the Hebrews, their commitment to monotheism and their participation in God's linear history meant that from beginning to the end, both the cosmos and their lives had purpose. The land, plants, and animals had inherent value, and humans were stewards of God's good creation. Human life was made with a sacred purpose and not something to be extinguished at the whim of the gods. The choices Israel made each day to love God and love their neighbor had transcendent meaning. Israel's earthly obedience to Yahweh was predicated on the revelation knowledge that he alone was good. The material world was good, and he alone created humankind for a good purpose. So the second idea here is that Genesis is a special revelation, not temple theology. Now, some scholars in both the unified and divergent worldview paradigm in those camps accept the possibility of special divine revelation, but differ on how much of it relates to the story of creation. A cross-section of scholars within each paradigm accept, at least at a minimum, that the Hebrews believed Genesis was given to Moses by God. This revelation knowledge enabled Moses to speak in some way above the din of cultural influence and provide Israel with knowledge, purpose, and moral significance. But where that line is drawn is hotly contested. Did God reveal truth only about spiritual matters, or did his revelation through Moses also reveal truth about our material origins? Now, as the 20th century turned into the 21st, the seeds of the scientific revolution germinated among scholars who rejected as anti-scientific and anti-intellectual any view of special revelation which overlapped with the domain of science. For scholars who embraced the unified worldview paradigm, the concept of special revelation was applied only to the spiritual or non-material teachings of the Bible. Specifically, these scholars claim the special revelation of Genesis only applies to the immaterial world of spiritual truths. Regarding the material world, they conclude Genesis was a product of the cognitive environment, or the worldview they shared with all the peoples of the ancient Near East. Scholars like John Walton argue that the only way the modern mind can properly understand Genesis is to understand the ancient Near East cosmologies which shaped the Hebrew worldview. Walton concludes, quote, as a result, we are not looking at ancient literature to try to decide whether Israel borrowed from some of the literature that was known to them. It is to be expected that the Israelites held many concepts and perspectives in common with the rest of the ancient world. This is far different from suggesting that literature was borrowed or copied. This is not even a case of Israel being influenced by the people around them. Rather, we simply recognize the common conceptual worldview that existed in ancient times. We should therefore not speak of Israel being influenced by the world. They were part of the world. Walton then does not see the need to look for a common Babylonian or Hittite or Egyptian source document, but concludes that the foundational worldview, what he calls the shared cognitive environment of the Hebrew, is the same. Therefore, their basic cosmology was the same. Kyle Greenwood, in his book Scripture and Cosmology, builds on the same basic theme as Walton and argues that the only way to understand the meaning of the text is to learn its ancient Near East context. Quote, biblical cosmology, he argues, is ancient Near East cosmology. Through the biblical authors, God spoke in the language of the common folk. Greenwood concludes that because the Tanakh, or the Christian Old Testament, relies on the language of a divine accommodation, and we've seen how that word is used or misused today, it is only possible to understand the meaning of Genesis as a product of the cultural, geographical, historical, and literary context. Greenwood's assumption is that the Hebrews had a unified worldview with their ancient neighbors, and like their neighbors, the Israelites used that Genesis myth as the paradigm to justify their temple practices. The distinction modern scholars like Walton and Greenwald make between the material and non-material world was not shared, however, by the writers of the Old Testament. One obvious example that undermines their theory is the preservation of the Old Testament in its written form. The effort to preserve the writings of the Tanakh speak to an essential characteristic of the Hebrew understanding of special revelation. The immaterial word spoken by God was connected to the material world through both the voice of the prophet and ultimately in the inspired text itself. The Creator God not only made the material world, he revealed to Israel a set of texts that gave them a concrete understanding of their historical origins, religious practices, and moral obligations. The Hebrew story of creation, for example, made no epistemological distinction between the material and immaterial worlds. Genesis was accepted as special revelation concerning both the material origin of the cosmos and God's spiritual purpose for humanity. Genesis, general revelation, what we see in the world around us in the book of nature then, was accepted by the Hebrews as physical evidence of Yahweh's creative power and holiness made visible to the nation in every generation. Yahweh's special revelation recorded in the Tanakh served as the authoritative record of God's relationship in history with his creation. Special revelation was given by Yahweh to advance Israel's knowledge about general revelation and provide a unique historical insight beyond their senses. In this way, Genesis is theo-history, a theology that reveals the truth regarding the origins of both the cosmos and of human life itself. And the third point I want to make is this: Genesis is theo-history, not mytho-history. So similar to scholars like John Walton, Peter Enns believes that the reason the opening chapters of Genesis look so much like the literature of ancient Mesopotamia is that the worldview categories of the ancient Near East were ubiquitous and normative at the time. When God, end quote. Now, when God then chose Abraham to be the patriarch of Israel, writes Enns, he also chose to adopt, quote, the mythic categories within which Abraham and everyone else thought, end quote. Therefore, Enns concludes that the cosmology of Genesis has the same essential qualities of other ancient Near East mythologies, while Genesis can still be used to teach us about metaphysical reality. It cannot speak to the modern scientific conceptions of cosmology. Now, once Enns' definition is accepted, Genesis is determined to have no meaningful connection to history or material origins, but serves only as a literary vehicle to convey spiritual truths about spiritual origins. Critical to this conclusion, shared in some fashion by scholars such as Enns, Welton, and Craig, and William Lane Craig, is how they define myth. The term myth is used by different scholars with a range of meanings across a philosophical and phenomenological spectrum. Many define myth using broad, sweeping categories, which include all ancient stories of creation. Some scholars, like William Lane Craig, argue that it's a fool's errand to even offer a concise definition of myth. Instead, Craig relies on the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein to offer 10 literary elements, which he believes demonstrate a family resemblance between Genesis and the ancient Near East mythologies. I will skip those 10 qualities just so I can get to the main point here. But now, unlike Craig's overly broad, I think, criteria for labeling Genesis as mytho-history, other scholars have suggested more inclusive definitions of myth. T.H. Gaster suggests, quote, that myth is a story of gods in which results of natural causes are accounted for supernaturally. Joseph Fenton-Rose, quoted by Robert Oden, defined myth as, quote, the traditional tales of the deeds of daimones, gods, spirits, and all sorts of supernatural or superhuman beings, end quote. So despite the different approaches from scholars like Craig, Gaster, and Fenton-Rose, it's important to ask, what do these scholars have in common? Hugh White's simple criticism of Fenton-Rose applies to Craig and Gaster equally when he writes, quote, the simple labeling of a story as a myth in this sense, though helping genre identification, does not necessarily advance our understanding of the text itself, end quote. Consequently, these different approaches to defining myth ultimately fail for several reasons. One, these definitions of myth use genre identification as a tool to justify the modern bias against the supernatural. Two, these definitions of myth offer no objective criteria for distinguishing between essential and non-essential features that may be common to each of these different creation stories. And three, these definitions of myth do not advance our understanding of how each creation story reflects the divergent worldview among these ancient Near Eastern civilizations. So turning back to Enns, he avoids some of these problems by defining myth as, quote, an ancient, pre-modern, pre-scientific way of addressing questions of ultimate origins and meaning in a form of stories. Who are we? Where do we come from? Quote. Craig makes a similar move by suggesting that Genesis 1 through 11 is mytho-history because these stories, he claims, are simply too fantastical and incoherent for the modern rational mind to believe. While these explanations may, to some degree, eliminate the bias against the supernatural, they ultimately replace the old bias with a new bias against pre-scientific history. Genesis, it is assumed by these scholars, cannot speak about the material origins of humanity because the ancients did not have access to our modern scientific forms of investigation. In this way, scholars who embrace the unified worldview paradigm treat modern science as the magisterial authority of interpreting Genesis. So where can we turn for a better definition of myth that does not beg the question of history? Again, John Oswalt defines myth as, quote, a form of expression where literary or oral, whereby the continuities among the human, natural, and divine realms are expressed and actualized by reinforcing these continuities and seek to ensure the orderly function of both nature and human society. That's the myth definition. Sorry about that. So a myth was a story used to maintain the status quo of political and religious order. Mythologies reinforce the worldview that events and people were meaningless. Events and people were meaningless pawns in the cosmic cycle. Mythologies were rooted in the assumption that human experience is nothing more than a physical analog for the metaphysical drama of the gods. Based on this definition, Oswald writes, quote, whatever the Bible is, it is not myth, end quote. In other words, regardless of what genre we assign to Genesis 1 through 11, the substance of the stories it contains was meant to be read as historical accounts of material origins. Oswalt makes this important observation, quote, ultimately the unique worldview of the Old Testament undergirds its claims of historical reliability. And although Moses certainly used the literary style of his time to communicate the inspired story of Yahweh's creation, his use of so-called mytho-genre does not justify the claim that the content itself was mytho-history. On the contrary, Genesis is not mytho-history, but a theological history of origins, or theo-history. That is to say, the cosmology of Genesis 1, given the divergent worldview paradigm of Hebrews, did not function as a fictional or cultic myth, but as a theo-history meant to connect Yahweh's eternal purpose with the real events that happen in space and time. Theo-history was a roadmap of human progress from our past in Genesis 1 through the daily experience of Israel and towards a future kingdom of God. In Hebrew theo-history, events and people were not meaningless characters in some primordial drama, but essential players in time and space used by God to advance his eternal plan. Hebrew theo-history was rooted in the presupposition that human experience is understood primarily through the special revelation of the one true God, and secondarily through the natural order and progress of time. For the Hebrews, God was and is separate from his creation. The power of God's spoken word recorded in Scripture not only brought the material world into existence and formed human life, but God's spoken word shaped the worship practices and ethical mandates that set Israel apart from their surrounding nations. And I'll conclude with this. The Hebrew story of creation told in Genesis is neither myth nor mytho-history. Genesis 1 through 11 is a form of theological storytelling, theo-history, that God used to reveal the material origins, moral duties, and destiny of humankind. The divergent worldview of the Hebrew world, Hebrew worldview from the ancient Near East cultures was illustrated in these three observations. I should go back, and I had those on there. Genesis is monotheism, not panentheism. Genesis is special revelation, not cultic theology. Genesis is theo-history, not mytho-history. These three distinctives leave us with an important question regarding the nature of scientific inquiry that we've really already addressed in many of these other presentations. So I won't recap that here. I will, however, leave you with this following comment. Hebrew cosmology reflects a unique worldview shaped by divine revelation. And because Genesis was written in the genre of theo-history, Hebrew cosmology offers us a dependable foundation for knowing something true about our material origins, shaping our ethical priorities, safeguarding the sacredness of human life, directing moral decision-making, recognizing the significance of historical progress, and guiding scientific inquiry into the book of nature.